Presentation on short-term liquidity ratios. Srinath Venuguri, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, Vishwesvaraya College for Advanced Studies, Palla. After this class, you will be able to understand the concept of short-term liquidity ratios and how to calculate short-term liquidity ratios. These are the two things you will get after this video. Before moving to short-term liquidity ratio, we need to understand what is liquidity. Liquidity means the ability of the firm or company to raise or arrange fund when they need. That means if the company wants to pay rupees 6,000 in the next month, we should check whether the company is able to pay the 6,000 in the next month. If they are satisfied, or if we have any resource available for that, we means the liquidity position is satisfied. So liquidity means we arrange the fund or raise the fund when the situation demands. It is liquidity. Then liquidity has two angle views. That means liquidity can be classified into two categories: short-term liquidity and long-term liquidity. Now, what is the meaning of short-term liquidity? The ability of the firm to meet its current liability out of its current asset. Current liability means the loss obligations which the company need to pay within an accounting year. And the current asset means the asset or resource which can be utilized, or the benefit of the asset can be fully utilized in one accounting year. Then long-term liquidities. What do you mean by long-term liquidity? The ability of the firm to meet its long-term debt out of company's long-term source. Long-term debts means debentures, bonds, etc. Then long-term source means share capital, shareholders fund, etc. can be a category of long-term sources. Then when we move to short-term again, then current asset means examples are debtors and cash at bank, cash in hand, inventories. These are the examples of current asset. And current liability means creditors, bills payable, and etc. Now here we focusing on short-term liquidity ratio. What are the different types of short-term liquidity ratios available? The main three category or main three classification of short-term liquidity ratios are current ratio, quick ratio, and absolute liquidity ratio. There are so many other ratios are available, like defensive interval ratio, cash reserve ratio. These are the short-term comes under the category of short-term liquidity ratio, but in the major point of view, the short-term liquidity ratios can be classified into current ratio, quick ratio, and absolute liquidity ratio. And what is current ratio? Current ratio is a short-term liquidity ratio which shows the relationship between current asset and current liability. It simply says that whether the current asset of the company is sufficient to pay off company's current liability. That means if our total amount of current assets is sufficient or adequate to pay off the current liabilities. Suppose if we take an example, if the company has the current liability of rupees 50,000 and the company has the current asset of rupees 60,000, normally we say that yes, it is accurate or it is adequate, but it is not adequate up to the significant level or for the future levels of the company. So we want to go deep. We want to calculate the current ratio. Current ratio is equal to current asset divided by current liabilities. The ideal current ratio is 2:1, which means the sufficient current asset. That means if we want to pay one current liability, we have at least two current assets. That means if a current liability amount rupees 50,000, we need to pay the 50,000, but we must have at least 1 lakh rupees as a current asset. So ideal current ratio is 2:1. In other meaning or in other interpretation, we can say is that if the company is able to pay off the current liability 2 times. These are the two interpretation given for current ratio. The first one is if we want to pay the one current liability, we have at least 2 current assets. And the other interpretation is that if the current ratio is 2:1, it says that the company's current asset is able to pay off the current liability 2 times. Then, how to calculate the current ratio? Identify the current asset from the balance sheet. Here is the part of balance sheets given to you Then the first step is to identify the current asset from the balance sheet. Here, these are the current assets of the company. Short-term investment, marketable securities and account receivable, cash in hand and bank balance, stock. These are the current asset of particular company. Then identify the current liabilities from the balance sheet. These are the current liabilities. Bank overdraft, sundry creditors, bills payable and outstanding expenses are the current asset of this particular company. Then step 3, divide the current asset total by current liability. Then here is the total. Current asset total is 10,80,000 and the current asset is current liability is 5 lakh. The current ratio is 2.16:1. Then fourth step is check the result with the standard norm. In the previous slide we says that the current ratio is 2:1. Here the current ratio is 2.16:1, which means as per the current ratio or in the terms of current ratio, the company's short-term liquidity position is satisfactory because it is more than the ideal current ratio. Then but if it is more than 3:1 or 4:1, the liquidity position of the company is satisfied, but the working capital or the short-term resources of the company is not utilized in better way. So ideal current ratio in technical term we can say 2:1 to 3:1, but literally it can say that 2:1. If the current ratio is more than 2:1, it is able or the company is able to meet its liquidity position. Then quick ratios. Quick ratio is a short-term liquidity ratio which shows the relationship between quick asset and current liabilities or quick liabilities. Then quick ratio is the another liquidity ratio, short-term liquidity ratio, which is used to find out the liquidity position of the company, and it shows the relationship between quick asset. Quick asset means the current asset except stock in hand and prepaid expenses, which means it is more liquid than current asset. Quick asset means it is a category of current asset, but it is more liquid than current assets. Then how to calculate the quick asset? Here is the step. It simply says that whether the quick asset of the company is sufficient to pay off the company's current liability. The quick ratio is also known as asset test ratio. Quick ratio can be calculated as quick asset divided by current liabilities. Ideal quick ratio is 1:1, which means if the company has one current liability, then company has at least one quick assets. In other point of view, we can say that if the current quick ratio is 1:1, that says that if the company has one current liability, the company's quick ratio or company's quick asset is meet the exact one current liability. Then how to calculate the quick ratio? Identify the current asset from the balance sheet. These are we showing the part of a balance sheet. Identify the current asset from the balance sheet, then calculate quick asset by deducting stock and prepaid expense from the current assets. These are the quick assets, which means quick asset is equal to total current asset of the company minus stock and prepaid expense. In this picture, we excluded stock, rupees 1,50,000. So current asset excluding stock and prepaid expense is termed as quick assets. Then current liability from the balance sheet, again these are the current liabilities of this particular company. Then divide the quick assets by current liabilities. These are the division. So the answer is 1.86:1. Check the result with standard norms. In the previous slide we can say quick ratio, ideal quick ratio is 1:1. Here the 1.86:1, which means that the company's, as per the quick ratio, the company's short-term liquidity position is satisfied. And last short-term liquidity ratio, absolute liquidity ratio. Absolute liquidity ratio is a short-term liquidity ratio which shows the relationship between cash and cash equivalents and current liability, which is more liquid than quick asset, which means the highly liquid element is taken for absolute liquidity ratio. It simply says that whether the cash and cash equivalent of the company is sufficient to pay off the company's current liabilities. If the company has a liability or current liability of rupees 50,000, how much cash and cash equivalent is able to pay off its part? So absolute liquidity ratio is equal to cash plus marketable securities divided by current liabilities. Ideal liquidity absolute liquidity ratio is 0.75:1, which means if the company has more than 0.75:1, the absolute in terms of absolute liquidity ratio, the company's liquidity short-term liquidity position is satisfied. How to calculate absolute liquidity ratio? Here is the picture. Again, the part of the balance sheet. Identify the cash and marketable securities from the balance sheet. Is the marketable securities and cash in hand we find out from this image. And bank balance. Cash and cash equivalents include cash in hand and cash at bank. So bank balance can also be taken. Then current liability from the balance sheet. These are the again current liabilities. Then divide cash and marketable securities by the current liability. These are the division 0.84:1. So in terms of absolute liquidity ratio, the current liquidity position or the short-term liquidity position of the company is satisfied, because the absolute result or ideal absolute liquidity ratio norms is 0.75:1. Here the 8.84:1, which means if the company has one liability, its current asset and current liability, its cash and cash equivalents and marketable securities are able to 84% of that liability.